Ethan Harrington, a 32-year-old billionaire and heir to Harrington Enterprises, had everything: power, influence, and a legacy to uphold. His company, built by his late father, was a leading empire in real estate and tech, trusted by millions. But Ethan suspected that someone in his inner circle was betraying him. After the sudden death of his father, Ethan's uncle Raymond, who had been appointed as interim CEO, had started making questionable decisions. Stocks fluctuated strangely, key employees were resigning, and funds seemed to be vanishing. Ethan knew that if he confronted his uncle outright, Raymond would cover his tracks. He needed proof, and there was only one way to get it: by disappearing and seeing the truth unfold from the outside. Late one evening, Ethan staged an elaborate accident. His yacht, the Orion, was found wrecked along the coastline with no sign of his body. The world believed he had drowned. News outlets mourned the loss of the young billionaire, and his uncle took over the company without hesitation. But Ethan wasn't dead. Disguised as a homeless man, Ethan took to the streets, abandoning his tailored suits for ragged clothes. He grew out his beard, changed his posture, and learned to survive with nothing. His goal? To infiltrate his own company and uncover his uncle's misdeeds. With nothing but a fake identity and a will of steel, Ethan wandered the city, watching from the shadows as Raymond made himself comfortable at the top. Ethan's days as a homeless man were grueling. He slept in alleyways, endured harsh weather, and experienced firsthand the struggles of those society ignored. But despite his hardships, he remained focused. He spent his days near Harrington Enterprises, observing his uncle's shady dealings from afar, occasionally sneaking into the building to gather intel. Yet, one of the hardest parts of his disguise wasn't the struggle, it was the way people looked through him. Except for her, at a small, cozy diner called Maggie's Place, Ethan found the one person who saw him as more than just a homeless man, Sophie Lane. Sophie was a kind-hearted waitress who had been working at the diner for years. Unlike others who dismissed him, Sophie greeted Ethan with warmth every time he entered. While most customers barely noticed the scruffy man sitting in the corner, she always made sure he had a hot cup of coffee. When he couldn't afford food, she'd sneak him extra leftovers, sometimes paying for his meals out of her own pocket. "You don't have to do this," Ethan told her one evening as she placed a steaming plate of food in front of him. Sophie just smiled. Everyone deserves kindness. Her words struck him. She didn't pity him, she simply saw him as a person. Over time, Ethan learned more about Sophie. She had dreams of opening her own bakery, but life had never made things easy for her. Despite working tirelessly, she barely made ends meet. Yet she never stopped being generous. But there was something else. Sophie was engaged. Her fiancé, Daniel Carter, was a wealthy businessman from a prestigious family. From the outside, their relationship seemed perfect, but Ethan noticed the sadness in Sophie's eyes whenever she mentioned him. One night, as Sophie cleaned up after closing, she sighed, lost in thought. "You okay?" Ethan asked from his usual seat in the corner. Sophie hesitated before answering. "It's just, I need to get married soon. It was my grandmother's last wish before she passed. She raised me, and before she died, she asked me to settle down with someone who would take care of me." She laughed bitterly. She thought Daniel was that person. But lately, "I'm not so sure." Ethan tilted his head. "Why?" Sophie hesitated, then sighed. "I don't know. Something just feels off." Ethan made a mental note of her words. He had been gathering information on people connected to his company, and Daniel Carter's name had come up multiple times. Something about the man didn't sit right with him. Then, one evening, Sophie's world shattered. She found out Daniel had been cheating on her. Sophie's hands trembled as she scrolled through the photos sent by a close friend. There was no mistaking it. Daniel was with another woman. His arm was draped casually around her waist, his lips brushing against her ear as they laughed together at an upscale bar. The timestamp on the photo was from last night, the same night he had told Sophie he was working late. Her heart clenched. She had suspected for weeks that something was wrong, but she had ignored the warning signs. His coldness, his frequent business trips, his dismissive tone whenever she tried to talk about their future. Now, the truth was staring her in the face. Daniel Carter, The man she had planned to marry had betrayed her. Sophie left the diner early that evening, meeting Air. She wandered aimlessly through the dimly lit streets, trying to process what had just happened. She found herself sitting on a park bench, head in her hands, when she heard a familiar voice. "Sophie." She looked up, surprised to see Ethan standing a few feet away. He had never spoken her name so directly before, always referring to her as Miss Sophie or simply offering a quiet nod. But tonight there was something different in his eyes, concern. "What are you doing here?" she asked, wiping at her cheeks. "I was just passing by," Ethan lied. In truth, he had seen her leave the diner looking distraught and had followed from a distance. "Are you okay?" Sophie let out a shaky breath, debating whether or not to tell him. But something about Ethan felt safe. "No," she admitted. "I just found out my ex-fiancé, has been cheating on me." Ethan clenched his fists. He had suspected Daniel wasn't a good man, but seeing the pain in Sophie's eyes filled him with quiet rage. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice filled with genuine sympathy. Sophie let out a bitter laugh. "It's ironic, really. I didn't even love him. I was marrying him because of my grandmother's wish. She wanted to see me settled before she passed, and I promised her I'd go through with it. I just didn't think he'd humiliate me like this." Ethan frowned. "You don't love him?" "No," Sophie admitted. "I guess I was just trying to honor my grandmother's last wish. But now, I don't know what to do." Ethan hesitated for only a second before speaking. "Marry me." Sophie blinked. "What?" "Marry me," Ethan repeated. "It doesn't have to be real. It can just be an arrangement, long enough for you to fulfill your grandmother's wish. Then we can quietly part ways." Sophie stared at him, stunned. "Why would you do that?" Ethan shrugged. "Because you've been kind to me when you didn't have to be. You didn't see me as just some homeless man. And right now, you need help. I can help you." Sophie bit her lip, processing his words. It was crazy, completely ridiculous. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. A fake marriage would fulfill her grandmother's dying wish, and she wouldn't have to spend another second being strung along by Daniel. But what did Ethan get out of this? "Are you sure?" she asked cautiously. "This is a big thing to do for someone you barely know." Ethan looked at her with a quiet intensity. "I know enough," he said simply. Something about the way he said it made Sophie's heart skip a beat. The next morning, Sophie called Daniel and ended their engagement. She didn't tell him she knew about the cheating. She simply told him she was done. Daniel, arrogant as ever, scoffed. "Good luck finding someone better, Sophie." She smirked. "I already have." That same day, she and Ethan went to the courthouse and got married. Sophie didn't know it yet, but Ethan wasn't just giving her an escape from a bad relationship. He had his own reasons for marrying her. Because Daniel wasn't just her ex-fiancé. He was an employee at Harrington Enterprises, the same company Ethan's uncle was trying to destroy. And soon, Daniel would learn the truth about the man he thought was just a homeless nobody. Sophie never thought she'd be married to a man she barely knew, let alone one she had met as a homeless drifter. But after exchanging vows at the courthouse, she and Ethan walked out as husband and wife, bound by an arrangement rather than love. "This is crazy," Sophie murmured as they exited the building, her marriage certificate in hand. Ethan chuckled. "A little," he admitted, "but you're free from Daniel, and your grandmother's wish is honored. That's what matters, right?" She studied him for a moment, wondering why he had been so willing to do this for her. Ethan had nothing to gain, or so she thought. "You're a mystery, Ethan," she said, shaking her head. He smiled slightly but didn't respond. Because the truth was, he had everything to gain. Over the next few weeks, Sophie and Ethan settled into their unusual arrangement. Sophie moved Ethan into her small apartment, helping him adjust to a more stable life, or so she thought. She assumed he was grateful for a roof over his head, unaware that Ethan had been raised in mansions, not alleyways. Meanwhile, Ethan continued investigating his uncle and the growing corruption at Harrington Enterprises. With his fake identity still intact, he managed to secure a janitorial position within the company, giving him access to files, conversations, and meetings without suspicion. And that's when he saw Daniel Carter. Sophie's ex-fiancé was working as a senior analyst for Harrington Enterprises, reporting directly to Raymond Harrington, Ethan's uncle. Ethan listened carefully as Daniel spoke in hushed tones with Raymond. They were discussing questionable financial dealings, money laundering schemes, and strategies to sell off Harrington Enterprises' most valuable assets without shareholders noticing. Ethan's blood boiled. His uncle wasn't just stealing from him, he was gutting the company his father had built. And Daniel was right there, benefiting from it all. Later that night, Ethan returned home to Sophie, still reeling from the discovery. "How was work?" Sophie asked, serving him dinner. Ethan hesitated before answering. Eye-opening, he said, watching her carefully. "Sophie, how much do you know about Daniel's jobs?" She frowned. "Not much. He always made it sound like he was one of the good guys, an honest businessman. But now, after everything, I don't know what to believe." Ethan clenched his jaw. She had no idea she had been engaged to a man helping destroy her husband's empire. And when she found out, it would change everything. Ethan knew he couldn't keep his secret much longer. His time as a homeless man had given him access to hidden truths, but now that he had the proof he needed, the next step was reclaiming his identity and exposing his uncle's corruption. The hardest part, however, was knowing that Sophie, the only person who had treated him with kindness, still had no idea who he really was. Every night, Ethan wrestled with the truth. She had married a man she thought was just a struggling drifter, but in reality, he was one of the richest men in the country. Would she feel betrayed when she found out? Would she think he had used her? One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Sophie studied Ethan with curious eyes. "You've been acting different lately," she said, "like you're carrying some big secret." Ethan exhaled, setting down his fork. "It was time." "Sophie," he said slowly, "there's something I need to tell you." She leaned forward, concern flickering across her face. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "I'm not who you think I am." Sophie frowned. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated for only a moment before reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a sleek black business card, one that bore the name Ethan Harrington, CEO of Harrington Enterprises. Sophie's eyes widened as she read the name. Then she laughed, shaking her head. "Very funny. You can't expect me to believe that." Ethan's expression remained serious. "It's the truth, Sophie. I faked my death to catch my uncle stealing from my company. I went undercover as a homeless man to see everything from the outside. That's how I ended up in the diner. That's how I met you." Sophie's breath hitched. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of a joke, but all she saw was raw honesty. You're Ethan Harrington?" she whispered. He nodded. "Yes." Her hands trembled as she placed the business card on the table. "So, all this time, the man I married isn't a homeless drifter. He's a billionaire?" Ethan swallowed hard. "Yes, and I swear, Sophie, everything I felt for you is real. You were the only one who was ever kind to me, not knowing who I was. That's why I married you. Not just to help you, but because I cared about you." Silence stretched between them. Sophie didn't know whether to be furious or overwhelmed. She stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "This is insane. Ethan, you let me believe you had nothing. Meanwhile, you own half the cities?" "I didn't do it to deceive you," Ethan said gently. "I did it to protect my company, to catch my uncle. And now that I have proof, I need to act." Sophie ran a hand through her hair. Everything made sense now. The way he always seemed to know things about business. The way he looked at expensive buildings like he recognized them. The way he had gone to work as a janitor, but never seemed like he truly belonged there. She exhaled deeply. "So, what happens now?" Ethan met her gaze, his voice firm. "Now, I take back what's mine, and I make sure Daniel gets exactly what he deserves." Ethan wasted no time setting his plan into motion. Now that Sophie knew the truth, he no longer had to hide who he was, and he could finally confront the people who had betrayed him, his Uncle Raymond and Daniel, Sophie's ex-fiancé. While Sophie was still processing the shock of Ethan's real identity, she had no doubts about one thing. Daniel had to pay for what he had done. Not just for cheating on her, but for his role in the corruption that nearly destroyed Ethan's company. One evening, Ethan sat Sophie down and pulled out a file he had compiled on Daniel. "This is everything I've gathered," Ethan said, flipping through documents filled with evidence of fraud, insider trading, and embezzlement. Daniel wasn't just working for my uncle, he was one of his most trusted men. He helped Raymond move money into offshore accounts and approved fake contracts that funneled company funds into his own personal accounts. Sophie's stomach churned. She had almost married that man. She shook her head. And he gets away with it because no one knows? Not for long, Ethan said, his expression sharp. "Tomorrow, I'm reclaiming my company. And when I do, Daniel is finished." The next day, Ethan walked into Harrington Enterprises very much alive. The entire office froze as he stepped through the grand entrance in a crisp black suit, no longer the unkempt man people had ignored in the hallways. Gasps, murmurs, and stunned silence followed him as employees realized that the man they thought was dead was very much alive and furious. Raymond, who had been sitting in the CEO's office, nearly choked on his coffee when Ethan barged in. "What the hell?" Raymond stammered, his face draining of color. "You're supposed to be dead." Ethan smirked. "Surprise?" Raymond tried to recover. "Listen, Ethan, I can explain. You can explain why you embezzled millions from my company? Why you used Daniel to cover your tracks? Why you thought you could steal what my father built?" Raymond opened his mouth, but before he could speak, security entered the room. Ethan turned to the guards. "Escort my uncle out of this building. Effective immediately. He is no longer part of Harrington Enterprises." Raymond's eyes widened in panic. "You can't do this. I'm family." "Exactly," Ethan said coldly, "which is why it hurts more that you betrayed me." As the guards pulled Raymond from the office, Daniel walked in, completely oblivious to what was happening. He froze when he saw Ethan. No way." Ethan smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "Hey, Daniel. Long time no see." Daniel gulped. This isn't possible. You're dead." Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Not dead, but you're done." With a snap of his fingers, Ethan's personal assistant handed Daniel a termination letter. "You're fired, Daniel," Ethan said flatly. "Effective immediately. Oh, and by the way, the SEC is investigating the fraudulent accounts you helped set up. You might want to get a good lawyer." Daniel's face turned ghostly white. "Ethan, please, let's talk." Ethan cut him off. "You had no problem betraying me, or cheating on Sophie, so now you get what you deserve." Daniel's jaw clenched. He turned to Sophie, desperate. "Sophie, you can't let him do this to me. Tell him I was good to you." Sophie scoffed. "You were good at lying, Daniel. Enjoy the consequences." And with that, security dragged Daniel out, just like Raymond. As soon as they were gone, Ethan turned back to the office, addressing the employees who had gathered in stunned silence. "I'm back," he announced. "Harrington Enterprises is under new management again. And this time, we're doing things right." A round of applause erupted as employees who had suffered under Raymond's rule finally breathed a sigh of relief. Ethan turned to Sophie, who had been watching the whole thing unfold with wide eyes. "Ready to start over?" he asked. Sophie smiled. "Absolutely." With Raymond and Daniel gone, Ethan took full control of Harrington Enterprises once more. The company, once on the brink of being dismantled from within, was now in the hands of the rightful owner. Ethan wasted no time cleaning up the mess his uncle had left behind, rebuilding trust, restoring financial integrity, and making sure the people who had stayed loyal during the company's dark days were rewarded. But even as he reclaimed his empire, there was one thing left unresolved: his relationship with Sophie. Sophie had stayed by his side throughout the chaos, but now that the dust had settled, she found herself questioning where they stood. Their marriage had started as a mere arrangement, a solution to a problem, not a declaration of love. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Ethan's luxurious penthouse, watching the city lights flicker below, Sophie finally voiced the question that had been lingering in her mind. "So, what happens now?" she asked hesitantly, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. Ethan turned to her, his gaze unreadable. "What do you mean?" Sophie let out a small sigh. "Our marriage. We never intended for it to be real. Now that your company is back in your hands, and I don't need to be married anymore to honor my grandmother's wish." I guess we're free to part ways. Ethan was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. Is that what you want? Sophie hesitated. Did she? She had told herself this was temporary. That Ethan had only married her out of kindness. That what they had wasn't real. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. She had fallen for him. And now, as she looked into his deep blue eyes, she realized she wasn't ready to walk away. What do you want, Ethan? She asked softly, her heart pounding. Ethan exhaled, setting his glass down before taking her hands in his. I want you, Sophie. Not as part of an arrangement. Not because of some deal. I want you because you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Sophie's breath caught. I've been in boardrooms full of the most powerful people in the world, Ethan continued, his voice raw with emotion. I've had wealth, influence, and everything money can buy, but none of it meant anything until you. You showed me kindness when I had nothing. You gave me your trust when I didn't deserve it. And somewhere along the way, I stopped pretending. I stopped seeing this as an arrangement. Sophie, I fell in love with you. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. She had never expected this. Never imagined that the man she once believed to be a homeless drifter would turn out to be the love of her life. I love you too, Ethan, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't realize it at first, but I do. Ethan smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, sealing the moment that had been destined from the start. This wasn't just an arrangement anymore. It was real. 1 year later, Sophie stood at the grand opening of her very own bakery, Sophie's Comforts. It had been her dream for years, and thanks to Ethan's support and her own hard work, she had finally achieved it. The bakery was warm, inviting, and filled with the smell of fresh pastries and coffee. Customers lined up outside, eager to try the homemade treats she had spent months perfecting. Ethan stood by her side, his hand wrapped around hers as they watched the ribbon-cutting ceremony. You did this, he said, pride shining in his eyes. We did this, Sophie corrected, squeezing his hand. Their love story had been anything but ordinary. It had started with secrets, betrayal, and a marriage of convenience. But in the end, it had led them to something real, something neither of them had expected but both of them had longed for. As the bakery doors opened and the first customers stepped inside, Ethan leaned in and whispered, You were always meant to be more than just my wife. You were meant to be my partner in everything. Sophie smiled. And you were always meant to be more than just a billionaire. You were meant to be mine. Daniel's downfall had been swift. He faced legal action for his role in the embezzlement scandal and lost everything, his career, his reputation, and the future he had taken for granted. Raymond, too, had suffered the consequences of his greed, exiled from the world of business with no chance of redemption. Meanwhile, Ethan and Sophie flourished. They built a life together filled with love, laughter, and success, proof that even the most unexpected beginnings can lead to the happiest endings. And in the end, what started as a fake marriage had turned into a love story for the ages.